I believe we are live. Welcome, welcome, welcome. How are folks doing today? Good to see you all. We're here. And it is the Christmas holiday. And for those of you who may not be celebrants of it, I don't care. You can have whatever religion you want. You can celebrate whatever holidays you want. I don't care. This whole war on Christmas thing, this idea that if you say to me, oh my goodness, if someone walks up to you and says, Happy Holidays, that you're supposed to be deeply offended by that and say, oh my gosh, I celebrate Christmas. How dare you say Happy Holidays? I'm not one of those people. I do celebrate the Christmas holiday. It's been a great day. Got to spend some time with family, have a nice dinner here in Brooklyn. But hey, you may not be that kind of person. You may celebrate another holiday. Not my concern. And I really didn't get that whole war on Christmas thing. That was a big thing when I was in high school. I remember there was just this anger that they called it winter break and not Christmas break. There was like a petition campaign. People were just deeply offended by it in my little town in Ohio. I did not understand it. I thought, just acknowledging other religions is not an affront to anyone who practices Christianity. So if you are somebody who celebrates the Christmas holiday, I remember, when I was a kid, Christmas morning was always a big thing. Then there was kind of a nice meal. And around this time of day on the Christmas holiday, I always remember being kind of bored. It was always nice and cold outside. It was always nice and warm inside. The heat would be on. I would just kind of be bored. So if you're bored, if you're at the bored part of the Christmas holiday, Christmas is finally here. It's evening time, and you want to spend it here with me. Enjoy yourself. Glad you made me part of your day. We got quite a bit to talk about here today. Want to know who invented war on Christmas? It was the neo-Nazis. Now that's Zachary Thorman. I did not know that. Tell me more about that, Zachary. I didn't know that. I thought it was Bill O'Reilly. What I remember was the Bill O'Reilly show. I remember Bill O'Reilly doing that on his program. He had a list of companies not to buy from because they said Happy Holidays and not Merry Christmas. Bill O'Reilly's been rather discredited. He's off the air, sexual harassment, all those lawsuits. But he was the guy leading the charge, if I remember correctly. But if neo-Nazis invented it, that's interesting because I've heard that a lot of these neo-Nazis are actually pagans. They're not Christian. They practice, like Nordic religions, pre-Christian religions. And from what I understand, interestingly, the Nazis themselves were quite critical of Christianity. There's a book called The Myth of the 20th Century by Alfred Rosenberg, who was like a theoretician of the Nazi Party, and he argued that Christianity had been distorted, the Bible had been distorted, and, the typical Nazi anti-Semitic stuff. But that's interesting. It wouldn't surprise me, though. And to be fair, if these Nazis do actually have these pre-Christian Nordic religions, if you look at the roots of the Christmas holiday, I don't think anyone, believes that Jesus Christ was actually born literally on December 25th. We all know that comes from Yuletide, which was a holiday celebrated by the pre-Christian and the pagan, or whatever you want to call them, Nordic, pagan, Germanic religions of Europe at that time. The tree, the presents around the tree. None of that has anything to do with, Christianity or Jesus or anything like that. We all know that that comes from some pre-Christian traditions. So maybe that's why Nazis would want to, quote unquote, defend Christmas from other holidays being acknowledged. Who knows? I'm not one to read into the minds of Nazis. Happy Solstice from Jacob. Well, thank you very much, Jacob. Jacob's a good guy, by the way. He's got a great podcast that he runs. He does some really hard-hitting interviews getting into what's going on in the world. People should check out Jacob Music. He's a great podcaster, Voice of Revolution podcast. What else we got here in the works? Oh, my bad. It was the Nazis themselves. Okay, well that makes sense, right? Because the Nazis, one of their big things was they talked about Kulturkampfs or Kulturkampfs or culture wars. And it was this idea that they were, fighting for culture, and it's ironic because culture wars now become a big thing in politics in general. We talk about culture wars when there's like battles over social issues, the battle over gay marriage and abortion, flag burning. These issues that aren't really related to economics, not really related to foreign policy, not really related to how the country is being run. But they are issues that the public is mobilized around. It's a culture war. Well, this comes from Kulturkampf, and this was a Nazi tactic for mobilizing the population. So maybe, according to Zachary, this was something the Nazis did, and maybe the war on Christmas was one of their original Kulturkampfs. So that's quite interesting. Let's see, something like 70% of Americans believe in angels and spirits. Well, That's interesting, but you always got to wonder on polls like that because what do they mean by angel and spirit, right? I mean, we all believe in spirit, right? And you say, oh, that guy who's cheering at the baseball game, he's got a lot of spirit. Do you hear all that spirit he's got? So, I mean, we believe that that guy has spirit. We don't believe there's some magical deity that's infected that guy who's playing baseball, but is that what people mean, or do they literally believe he's like possessed? That's where it gets a little interesting in polls like that. And it also can get interesting if you literally ask people. Like, I remember when I was growing up in Ohio, a lot of my classmates were very, very Christian, deeply evangelical and conservative, and they did not like Harry Potter, and they did not like anything, in which there was like witchcraft was being promoted. And somebody I knew used to always say to them, "Well, doesn't that mean that you believe in witchcraft?" And they'd say, "What do you mean?" Well, if you're afraid of it, if you think it has the power to actually do you some harm, do you not actually believe in witchcraft? And it was funny because these evangelicals who were very opposed to witchcraft would never actually admit that they believed it had power. But then if they were opposed to witchcraft, then they must believe that it must work. So that got a little mystical and strange. And the other thing I noticed when I first moved to Cleveland, when I was living in Cleveland, is the area I grew up in, everyone was an evangelical, a lot of Christian fundamentalists, a lot of older religious sects, a lot of like Mennonites, Apostolics, Brethren. When I moved to Cleveland, though, interestingly, I noticed that while people weren't as into the evangelical stuff, when it came to like ghosts, psychics, aliens, paranormal, a lot of people who probably, if they'd been in my little town, would have been into evangelical stuff. In Cleveland, they were into the paranormal and witchcraft, and that I guess it was almost kind of a rite of passage for teenage girls to go through a phase where they were interested in Wicca and stuff like that, and that just kind of seemed to be just kind of a common thing for Midwestern, Cleveland area young women to go through. So that's kind of an interesting thing. I mean, all of these things are very, very, very interesting to take into account. I mean, if you go all over the world, people have all kinds of beliefs about religion, but they also have all kinds of beliefs about paranormal stuff. And there will be some people you'll meet that are just really, really anti-religious. Islam, Christianity, Judaism, they hate all of that. But then the second you start talking about spirits and demonic possession and Wicca and voodoo, they love that stuff. That I don't understand quite. It's like you reject one as superstition, but one is real. I mean, I'm not judging. I'm saying, why is one getting a pass and not the other? Not my business. I try to stay out of it. I respect all religions, all religious beliefs here. But it's interesting to think about, especially here on Christmas, which is the center of all this controversy that's been going on, this war on Christmas nonsense. Marxism is a messianic universalist religion too. That's very interesting. Now, Marxists will get quite fired up about that, right? They'll insist, well, Marxism is scientific. It is not religious, right? There's this whole book by who is it? Frederick Engels, the collaborator of Karl Marx. He wrote this book, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. And he had this whole thing distinguishing the Marxist brand of socialism from the more religious brands of socialism that existed prior. But a lot of people see kind of a religious imagery in Marxism. They say, look, you're trying to create a new world, heaven on earth. You see some big gigantic battle between good and evil taking place at the end of time. And who's to say what religion really is? And that's where it starts to get aligned, right? I mean, is religion, does religion have to be recognized as religion? Or like, a lot of people say that these Star Trek fans who are really, really into Star Trek, that's their religion. Now, they don't literally believe in Captain Kirk. They don't think that Captain Kirk is real, but their life revolves around Star Trek. They go to every convention. They watch every show. So is that a religion for them? So if Marxism is a way of life, and you meet some of these people that they go to every rally and every protest, and they're out there selling newspapers every day, is it their religion? I mean, it's their social circle. It's their belief system that they kind of center their life around. So is it their religion? Now, they would insist it wasn't. A good Marxist will say, well, no, Marxism is scientific, religion is idealist, so they'll insist that that's not the case. But then that starts to get into the fuzzy area of what actually is religion. And if religion is simply something you base your life on, it's a community you live in, it's a values you live in, one could make a strong argument that Marxism is a religion. The other thing that I think is quite interesting is up until the fall of the Soviet Union, atheism, and the word atheist was always associated with the left and Marxism, right? It was, the word itself, atheist, comes out of the French Revolution, means without religion, and it was associated with, with the leftism and the struggles against the church, which was seen as this authoritarian institution. But now we have these new atheists, they call them. And I mean, even before the rise of what you call new atheism now with Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and people like that, even before that you had Ayn Rand. And you have these certain people that the problem with religion is that Ayn Rand especially, with her, the problem with religion is it makes people feel guilty, and it makes people want to give and be nice to each other and have compassion, and it gets in the way of what she calls the virtue of selfishness. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Ayn Rand referred to Christianity as what she called the guilt-peddling Jesus industry. And these folks, these new atheists, they're not left whatsoever. In fact, if you listen to Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, a lot of what they say really kind of justifies U.S. foreign policy. They're quite critical of Christianity, but then they're really critical of Islam. And if you listen to them, it's like every conflict, every war in the world is really about religion. You watch Bill Maher's Religulous, for example. It ends with this montage where they're showing IRA fighters and Palestinian struggles, and it's like saying, oh, all of this killing is because of religion. Well, I don't think it's simply because of religion in Ireland. I don't think it's simply because of religion in Palestine, but it's this kind of simplistic thinking where it's like religion is the problem, and people who are religious are just not as smart as we are, and obviously, Christianity, it's problematic, but Islam is the most problematic. These folks are pushing a narrative. That's what I think. I think if you look at new atheism, this is a narrative, and it's very much a what you might call a first worldist narrative. It's kind of this understanding that we are the smart ones, we're the divine ones. All these people in poorer and historically colonized parts of the world are not as smart and divine and brilliant as we are, and we need to kind of impose our brilliance on them. There's an element of white man's burden, what you might call social imperialism, in a lot of this new atheism stuff that I find a little bit disturbing. Oh, what else have we got here? Thoughts on the reforms in Vietnam in contrast to socialism with Chinese values? Well, that's very interesting. Now, when I was in Ecuador, I attended the World Festival of Youth and Students in 2013. I was also at the more recent one in Russia. But when I was at the World Festival of Youth and Students in 2013 in Quito, Ecuador, I went to a workshop by the Ho Chi Minh Communist Youth Union of Vietnam. And when I was at that workshop, I listened very carefully. They gave a very detailed presentation. And the Vietnamese actually said, we are not a socialist country, but we would like to become one. And they were emphasizing they did not consider Vietnam to yet be socialist. They considered it to be a dictatorship of the proletariat. But they did not consider it to be socialist. They said that socialism requires some level of development. They said they considered China to be socialist, Cuba to be socialist, North Korea to be socialist, but they did not have yet achieved that level of development to fully call themselves a socialist country. Now, I thought that was a very interesting insight and a very interesting analysis. And there's a very interesting document written by the Communist Party of Vietnam that they presented in Havana, Cuba. And it's called, I forget the title of it, but it's about the question of what is socialism and capitalism. And it's it's about 20 pages, and it's a very interesting document. The Vietnamese Communist Party, they do have a very, very clear view. Now, for a while, China and Vietnam were not getting along. There was kind of a clash going on. But at the moment, I think China and Vietnam are getting along better than they had been. For a while, Vietnam was even talking about joining the TPP. There was talk of maybe even some U.S. military bases in Vietnam. Vietnam felt like China was, the word they used was like bullying, something like that. So it was quite an interesting time, but at the moment, I think China and Vietnam are getting along, and who knows, I don't know if that's the current position, but when I was in Quito, Ecuador, meeting with the Ho Chi Minh Communist Youth Union, what they explained was that they did not consider Vietnam to be fully socialist, and I thought that was an interesting position. They said that their goal is to create socialism. It's the Communist Party that leads Vietnam, but they're not there yet. All right, greetings from Brazil. Hey, great, glad to hear from you. I went to Brazil back in 2016 for an amazing conference by the CSB, the Trade Union Center of Brazil. And that was an amazing conference. You had activists from like every corner of that country, trade unionists, people who organized in their communities, and they were there. And it was basically in the lead up to the coup that happened, right? Because just a few months after I left, there was that coup. And the person I shook hands with at that convention, Michel Temer, is now the president of Brazil. And I did not know that at the time that I was shaking his hand. I didn't know it, but apparently he was working with the CIA to bring down Dilma Rousseff and kind of usher in some of the neoliberalism that they're having now in Brazil. I mean, mass privatizations and the economy has gotten a lot worse. Now, I was there in 2016 for this amazing convention of very, very dedicated activists. I gave a presentation about oil price manipulation and how the Wall Street bankers were trying to manipulate the price of oil. It was quite an exciting trip. I was only in one city. I was in Brasilia. And that's not, people say that's not, you really want to see Brazil, you need to go to Rio, you need to go to other parts of the country. But I was only in Brasilia, but I learned a lot about the history of the country. And to attend that big conference of labor activists was really educational for me. So, my heart goes out to you folks in Brazil. I mean, you've been through a lot. I mean, you've struggled to bring down military dictatorships. You've got your trade unions. You've got to deal with, some all kinds of people trying to divide the place. I know China is there helping Brazil to build some new electrical power plants, hydroelectrical, if I'm not mistaken. That's very exciting. Hey, glad to hear from you folks in Brazil. Things going on in South America are very important. It's interesting. When I was in Brazil, I had come there and I once I said something about Latin America and they corrected me and they said Brazil is not Latin America. Latin America refers to Spanish-speaking countries, but in Brazil they speak Portuguese, and so they are not part of Latin America. They are part of South America, and that was a very important point that I learned while I was down there. And I think most people from the USA would probably make that mistake. They assume that anything south of the border is Latin America. That's not the case, actually. Belize, that's another country. They don't speak Spanish in Belize. They speak English. So Belize is not part of Latin America. It's part of Central America. It's not part of Latin America. That's a mistake that folks will often make who aren't familiar with the region. And up here, we, in the USA, it's so silly. In the USA, a lot of times they'll refer to anyone from south of the border as a Mexican. They'll say, oh, he's a Mexican. I've even heard people say, oh, he's a Honduran Mexican. He's a Venezuelan Mexican. Well, no. Mexicans are from Mexico. Venezuelans are from Venezuela. Hondurans are from Honduras. And speaking of that, we did just see that now not only is it the United States that is moving its embassy to Jerusalem, but Guatemala is also moving its embassy to Jerusalem. So there you go. The USA is not completely alone. They have Guatemala on their side. Just like at the UN when there was that blowout resolution, right? Remember, it was 128 countries voted against the resolution, and then there were 9, or voted in favor of the resolution, and then there were 9 that voted against it, along with the United States, Israel, and there was Togo, Micronesia, Guatemala, Honduras, Palau. These huge, powerful, dynamic allies. Kind of reminds you of George W. Bush's coalition of the willing. You remember that? Well, it was like, when almost all of Western Europe was not willing to go along with his war except for the British, and then there was this coalition of the willing, and it was like, okay, well, the world has rejected Bush's invasion of Iraq, but Estonia, they were on board. It was just, it shows that there's big divisions. I think there's big divisions. I think Obama represented a wing of the rich and powerful in the United States that wanted to have a relationship or a stronger relationship with Europe. The fact that Obama actually went to Berlin and gave that talk during the election, that was not an accident. And I think that Trump represents a wing of American capital that isn't as tied into Europe. And kind of frustrated with Europe. And that's one of the points of division. It's important to look at this because it's one, on the one hand, sometimes people will say, look, it doesn't really matter, right? Republicans, Democrats, it's the same stuff. What matters is how much, the balance of forces and the class struggle and people protesting. That's all true. However, I must say that at no point in my lifetime has the rich and powerful, the ruling class of the United States been this divided. Huge amounts of division among the ruling class right now. And if we're not paying attention to that, and you think this Russia investigation, we know that, come on, you think Russia rigged the elections. Come on, that's ridiculous. But why are they keeping this going? What's this about? Why is it's been a year of Trump and we're still having this Russiagate conversation? What's that about? Why? There are big divisions in the ruling class. That's what this is about. The rich and powerful don't see eye to eye on a lot of issues, especially foreign policy. And that's just a reality. Why was it that Trump was bashing Saudi Arabia up and down during his campaign? And then when he took office, then he went to Saudi Arabia and danced around with the king. What's going on there? There are big divisions, things that wouldn't happen before. Alliances, policies, things are up for debate right now. There is a struggle within the ruling class. All right, what else do we got here? Russiagate is a deflection. It's virtue signaling. Well, yes and no. Now, people often will compare Russiagate to McCarthyism, and one of the key things to remember about that is that McCarthyism didn't start out with the Democrats being attacked by the Republicans. McCarthyism started out within the Democratic Party. It was the Truman Democrats going after the Roosevelt Democrats who were in organized labor and had ties with the Communist Party USA. And it was a purge within one party. And then eventually the Republicans started this who lost China thing, and it turned into a Republicans going after Democrats thing, and then McCarthy was censured, and then the country moved on. And I mean, that was over the course of almost a decade. But regardless, if you look at what's going on now, there is a fight within the Republican Party, very much so a fight within the Republican Party. And it's like the Steve Bannon, America First, quote-unquote, economic nationalist wing of the Republicans, is really kind of facing off against the more mainstream and neoconservative Republicans. And so even within the Republican Party, there are some pretty solid divisions. And I don't think it's purely deflection. Sure, the Democrats are saying, oh, look, Trump is a bad leader. He collaborated with the Russians. You should vote for the Democrats. Sure, there's that element. The Democrats are certainly playing their angle. But some Republicans are playing this too, and there's a real division within the Republican Party itself. And when you see fights within the two parties that are over issues like this indicates some serious division within the circles of power in the United States. So there we go. Let's see what else is going on here. What about Mike Pence? Will he become the new... Ooh, wow. Well, that's an interesting question you got there, Kermit. And I will say, Mike Pence, that's an interesting guy. Now, I saw a joke that's going around the internet. It goes like this. Mike Pence was a radio host in Indiana, and he blamed all of Indiana's problems on Obama. Then Mike Pence ran for governor, and he became the governor of Indiana. And from the governor's mansion, he blamed all of Indiana's problems on Obama. And now, Mike Pence is the vice president. Oops. That's how it is, folks, because Mike Pence, he's interesting. Now, he's a very skilled, you want to talk about this guy was a radio host, and that debate that he did with the Democratic VP nominee, I don't even remember his name, Tim Kaine, that debate, you watched it, it was a blowout. Tim Kaine was nervous, he was scrambling, he was rambling, he was quite nervous there and feisty and on the attack, and Mike Pence, he was just solid. He was just, and whenever I see Mike Pence, I think of like a cowboy movie. I think of like some guy who's in a cowboy movie and he's like, yeah, I am Mike Pence. Yeah. It's like he's trying to sound like this kind of tough guy. I know Mike Pence is also an evangelical, and that Trump was kind of weak on the evangelicals. All of Trump's, what you might call his obscenity or his crude language wasn't really flying. So for him to nominate Mike Pence, got him some credibility with evangelicals. But Mike Pence is an interesting one. He's an entertainer. This is somebody who was on the radio. He kind of, had, pushed like ideological conservatism and Christianity. He became the governor, and now he's the vice president. And I think, he is more trusted by the establishment by far than Trump is. No question about that. So, yeah, there you go. But Mike Pence is an interesting character. He's got this kind of ultra-masculine thing. You feel like there's I know he himself was, I don't think he was ever in the military, but there's a kind of like the guys who had been in the military, guys who like guns, they hear him and they hear that slow speaking. I'm a Christian. And I am a conservative, and I don't like Hillary Clinton. They like that. They like that kind of, it appeals. There's something appealing about it. So there you go. But there you go. There's something, he has a base. There are people that like that kind of thing. And Mike Pence, he performs. He's a good speaker. Oh, we got questions about Tito and why is Tito isn't more popular in North America? I don't know. You would think, Tito, when he was leading Yugoslavia, he did side with the United States in the Korean War. he was more friendly to the United States than anybody else in Eastern Europe. He broke with Stalin in 1948, and he was kind of an ally of the USA. But did that stop Wall Street from dismantling the socialist Yugoslavia, from funding separatist movements, from eventually bombing Serbia, and breaking Kosovo away from Serbia? And I mean, did that stop them? No. I mean, people seem to have it in their minds that the USA attacks countries because of statements that the leaders make, or the USA attacks countries because they're quote-unquote anti-American or hostile. Well, that's not the case. I can tell you one thing, the leaders of China, the leaders of Russia would love to get along with the United States of America. They're not flaming anti-Americans. They would love to get along with it, but the USA will not get along with them. And there's a reason for it, and that reason is material. It's not an intellectual reason. It's not an argument, an ideological thing. It's material. Russia is a huge exporter of oil and natural gas, and every ounce of oil and natural gas that they sell is an ounce of oil and natural gas that the Americans do not sell to the world. And these new sanctions, they blatantly said it when they put these new sanctions on Russia on August 2nd. These new sanctions, they said, these sanctions are about getting our gas to our European allies. And the Germans were furious because Russia's right there. It's not that far from Germany. But for them to have to import their natural gas all the way from the United States, it's going to cost them way, way more. But it's about a struggle for markets. And with China, sure, they don't have a lot of oil and natural gas. What do they have? Steel, aluminum, copper. China is an industrial powerhouse. They are producing huge, huge amounts of raw materials at this point, right? I mean, it's a center of production. It's a booming center of production. And every ounce of steel that anyone in the world buys from China is an ounce of steel that they are not buying from us. And if you read the Wall Street Journal last year, there were all kinds of articles about how the price of steel was getting lower and lower and lower because China was churning out so much of it. At this point, China produces half of the steel in the world. Half of the steel in the world is being produced in China. Now, prior to 1949, there were no steel mills in China. China did not have a single steel mill prior to 1949. I've heard some people contest it and say, well, they might have had this one small one here. Well, my point stands. Today, China produces half the steel in the world. But communism doesn't work, right? Communism never produces anything. The only way for a country to get rich is with total free market capitalism, right? There you go. And, let's not forget that in the 1930s, 40s, and even up into the 70s and 80s, it was actually the Soviet Union that was producing the world's highest amounts of steel. That's a point that people often forget as well. I mean, I was watching MSNBC one time. The anchor actually said, communism, it produced nothing but gulags. Well, and, most of the steel in the world. But, these are not important points. Just remember the neoliberal narrative, kids. There we go. Communism produces iPhones. Well, not exactly. Now, there was a very interesting article that I read in Bloomberg News, and this was by a guy named Adam Minter. And he talked about how, during his campaign, Trump said that he was going to force iPhone or an Apple to start making their iPhones in the USA. And this guy, Adam Minter, pointed out why that's not going to happen. And basically, it's very interesting, but if you read about it, so, Apple produces their iPhones in China. But in order to do it, they go to the Chinese government and they say, all right, we need this many workers, we need this many engineers, we need this many technicians, and the Chinese government arranges it all for them. And they talked about how if the USA were going to set up an iPhone manufacturing facility, it would require like the biggest mobilization of the population since the Second World War. It would be huge. There'd be hundreds of thousands of people moving around. They'd be rebuilding whole cities. This is stuff China can do very, very easily because they have a state-run economy and it's tightly organized and the Communist Party runs the place. We can't do that kind of thing over here. And on top of that, you don't just need shop floor and factory workers to make iPhones. You also need engineers. And at this point, we don't graduate enough scientific and engineering people to run iPhone manufacturing. We just simply don't have the people here being educated at our universities. And that's a big problem. We only graduate, according to this article, it was something like 7,000 or 8,000 of the kind of people that they need every year. And to do it, they would need at least 20,000 people. I mean, this is a big point, and on top of that, if you're going to make manufacturing, you need good roads to transport it on. You need trains that you can can pack those iPhones on someplace when you ship them away. The USA is just not a really good place to do domestic manufacturing. Back when we were the center of world manufacturing, that was, when the rest of the world had been, blown up and destroyed by the Second World War. The USA had not been touched really. I mean, there's Pearl Harbor and some fighting, near Alaska or whatever. But other than that, the USA was pretty untouched. And so we were making steel, we were making cars, and the world was buying it from us while they were rebuilding from the war. And so that was kind of the heyday. That was the dominance of U.S., what you might call U.S. imperialism, or the dominance of American capitalism, capitalist Western financial monopolies. And the world was buying from the USA. But at that point, Roosevelt had already built a huge network of trains. They had built airports. LaGuardia Airport here in New York had been constructed. Highways had been constructed, and a huge amount of infrastructure existed. And that infrastructure is now crumbling. The neoliberal ideology, people say neoliberalism is just capitalism. It's a little bit different. Even people like Adam Smith understood that some things had to be run by the government. They said, look, all right, maybe the government, everything's privatized, but you still have to have a government road, right? That government's got to pay for a road so that all the stores, that on there people can drive to those stores and spend their money. The government's got to do the mail, right? Maybe people are making money and everything's private, but you still need the mail to be run by the government. These folks who believe in neoliberalism, people like Milton Friedman, people like who else? Alan Greenspan. These neoliberal ideologues, they don't think that. They think the roads would be better if they were privatized. They think the mail would be better if it was privatized. That's why we're privatizing police and privatizing prisons, privatizing the military with military contractors. These people believe in capitalism in this insane way. They make Adam Smith look like a socialist. I mean, that's how these neoliberal ideologues, their understanding of how the world should work, their utopian vision of capitalism, is deeply, deeply insane. And it's at the point that it's not even making the USA a good place for capitalism at this point. And, the USA, the roads are crumbling, the highways are crumbling, we're not drinking clean water. I'll take a sip after I say that. Here I am in Brooklyn. But all across the country, people are drinking water that isn't being purified. All kinds of things are just falling apart, and this isn't really good for capitalism. But the people who are hurt by it, I must say, are the lower level capitalists. It's those small shopkeepers and store owners. And they're the ones that are hurt by this. The people who are hurt by it, the big, gigantic oil companies, they don't care. They're getting their oil out of the ground. They're selling it at the gas station. They don't care. And that's the divide that we're seeing. There is a growing divide among, the ruling class, where the highest levels of capital at this point, I've read, there's a very good book by an economist, a Marxist economist, Nelson Peary. And he talked about how the highest levels of capital, finance capital, they really at this point don't even have any real national loyalties. A lot of them, they're tied in with Europe, and there's a huge internet, the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, and there's a lot of these capitalists that really they don't mind the USA crumbling. They can keep making their profits in the process. And so, I think a lot of what's going on with Trump, as well as what's going on with what they call the New Right in Europe, the Brexit folks, these are like lower level capitalists who feel like, hey, these big level capitalists are letting the place fall apart. We are also hurting in the process, and they tend to be more isolationist and anti-immigrant and nationalistic and right wing, and it's complicated. It's very complicated. Divisions in the ruling class. I will repeat this in my analysis. Divisions among the American ruling class are the highest they've been in my lifetime. I have not seen them fighting like this. Oh boy, our ruling elites are globalists. They have no loyalty to our people or place. I would say that absolutely. The capitalists, they are loyal to their profits. At the end of the day, that's what, those who own the means of production, the banks, factories, and industries, they want to make profits. They're not religious. They're not loyal to some religion. They're not loyal to some country. They might use that kind of rhetoric in order to advance themselves or to influence other people. But at the end of the day, that's what they want, is they are loyal to their own profits. Let's see what I've been missing here. I've been talking a little while. Oh boy, we're talking about all kinds of things. Wow, we're talking about economics at this point. Well, I want to change gears here just briefly because I don't know if folks noticed, but the media today, it's Christmas, right? It's the Christmas holiday. They couldn't give us a break from this anti-Russian hype. So the big news today is that, oh my gosh, Alexander Navalny is not going to be able to run in the Russian presidential election. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Well, this is not news to anybody. In fact, when I was in Russia, when I was in Russia, I went to a press conference, and the head of the election commission was asked, will Alexander Navalny be able to run? And they said, no, he committed a crime, and he committed the crime to the point that he was in prison, like a serious crime, like a felony, and because of that, he's not permitted to run according to Russian law. And they said, so his supporters should, find another candidate to run. Well, that's not now. That's their law. That if you're convicted of a very, very serious crime, you're not permitted to run, and that's what the election commission determined. Well, that's Russian law. This is not a scandal here. They're trying to make it sound like this proves that Russia is an evil dictatorship or something. Well, the Communist Party is running a candidate. The Liberal Democratic Party is running a candidate. There are all kinds of people who have filed to be candidates in the upcoming election. Alexander Navalny, this guy who's leading protests, who's just loved on American media, he's this, he's American media's favorite Russian. He's against the Russian government. He's not going to be able to participate because he's not legally eligible. In the USA, to be elected president, you have to be born in the United States. So there was a time when I know when he was the actor who was the head of governor of California for a while. What was his name? Oh, Arnold Schwarzenegger. When Arnold Schwarzenegger was saying, he wanted to be president, but he couldn't be because he wasn't born in the United States. He was Austrian, and no one said, "Oh my goodness, the USA has blocked Arnold Schwarzenegger from running for president. Such a totalitarian state. Oh my gosh." It's like they never give you a break with this. It kind of reminds me of when there was a constitutional referendum in Venezuela, and they just wanted to get rid of term limits. And the media in the USA said, "Oh my gosh, they're voting on whether Hugo Chavez will be president for the rest of his life." No, they were voting on whether or not they would have term limits. Japan doesn't have term limits. Britain doesn't have term limits. But they made it sound like, "Oh my God, he's going to be president for the rest of his life." It's like it's so ridiculous. Saudi Arabia, that's a king. That's right, he's a king. When he died, Ban Ki-moon called him a wise and compassionate leader, right? They cut people's heads off in public. They crucify their bodies afterwards. This is a king. He's a king. He's a sultanate. But if you're the president of a country that challenges the dominance of the Wall Street billionaires, you're a dictator. And no matter what you do, it's dictatorship. This is ridiculous. When I was in Venezuela in 2015, I saw ads for the opposition party on television. I saw people marching in the streets against the opposition. I saw, posters, campaign signs for the opposition. And then, they had a vote, and the opposition won control of the National Assembly. But yet U.S. media kept insisting it was a dictatorship. Really? Seriously? They kept insisting it was a dictator? I kept hearing U.S. media, the brutal dictatorship in Venezuela. How is it a dictatorship if the opposition is everywhere? What can you do? How much more can you accommodate them? This should be proof to anybody that no matter what you do, if you're an opponent of the power of Wall Street and all that, you're a dictator. And, if you're Saudi Arabia and you buy huge amounts of U.S. weapons and you are doing oil deals with all the big major oil companies, then, you're a wise, compassionate leader who, he's modernizing. Now he lets women drive. That new king of Saudi Arabia, he allows women to drive now. What a modernizer. The Wall Street Journal, which I read regularly, is partially owned. News Corp. It's actually partially owned by Saudi Arabia. And every time, now that they let women drive, now in these mostly symbolic, irrelevant local elections, they do allow women to vote in these elections that have no meaning because the country's an absolute monarchy. And so they always run an article in the Wall Street Journal about how they're modernizing in Saudi Arabia. Oh my goodness, they are just modernizing. This is a joke. This is a joke. The hypocrisy is very extreme. So don't let U.S. media ever start telling you about who's a dictator and who's democratic, because the hypocrisy is beyond there. I remember when the Iraq War was happening back in 2003, so many people I knew were insisting that, we were invading Iraq because it's a dictator there, and we want them to be democratic. And it's just like, why are you falling for this? Do facts matter to anybody? Oh boy, oh boy. All right. Well, yes, people are calling for death for Wall Street scumbags. All right. What else do we have here? Petrodollars. Oh boy. A lot of things to talk about. Another thing I saw today that was in the news. So, there's all kinds of talk, for years, the far right wing, and when I say far right wing, I'm talking like pre-neoconservative right wing, the America First crowd, the folks who used America First before Trump did, the John Birch Society. They've had this, get the U.S. out of the UN and the UN out of us. This John Birch Society. They've been against the UN. Well, apparently, Trump did just arrange for the USA to significantly decrease the UN budget and stop funding the United Nations. Now, again, that's a gift to these lower level of capital that don't feel like the UN is very useful. I mean, the UN can be quite useful, but Obama and Samantha Power and that crowd, they loved the United Nations. They thought it was very, very important. But these paleo-conservative, more far right-wing elements don't like the UN. In fact, I remember when I was, growing up back in Ohio, there were a lot of people who were always paranoid about the black helicopters. Do folks remember that? The black helicopters, the black helicopters. And it was this idea that the UN was going to invade the United States. And that was very, a lot of these people were convinced, and they would say, and the funny thing is, if the sun is behind any helicopter, it looks like a black helicopter. So, people were always citing I saw a black helicopter, I saw a black helicopter. And this was like part of the militia, this was the mythology. But there was this idea that the UN was going to take over the USA and come here and take our guns away. And that's a big part of like far right-wing rhetoric. We're not talking, mainstream Republicans, neocons. We're talking like the far right, the John Birch Society, and a lot of the forces that now are quite prominent in the Republican Party, and that's a very interesting thing. These forces were kicked out of the Republican Party back in the 1960s, William F. Buckley and the rise of neoconservatism. But now a lot of them are back, and the Tea Party was kind of the beginning of it, because the messaging strategy of the Republicans in like the 70s, 80s, up into the 90s, Bush was kind of the end of it, was this kind of like, very, conservative, this is the greatest country in the world. If you don't like it, you should move to some other country. America is the land of freedom. It was this very kind of simplistic stuff, not much ideology. And it was kind of this opposition. It was like the left and liberals were intellectuals who think they're smarter than everybody else. And, it was this culture wars. That was the Rupert Murdoch, Leo Strauss. This was the neoconservative political model. And the financial crisis, blew it to shreds. Because you talk to average people in America, they want things to change. The mantra of the neocon kind of conservative, well, don't fix it if it ain't broke. Well, people want it, people feel like America is broke. So, all of a sudden during the financial crisis, I remember 2008, all of a sudden there was this surge of libertarianism. And it was like the USA is communist. So it was like capitalism had failed. Don't worry, well, that's because the USA is communist. It was like this panic. And you had Glenn Beck. All of a sudden, in addition to Bill O'Reilly, you had Glenn Beck on Fox News. And he would give these kind of conservative sermons, in which he'd be, explaining that the USA has been a communist country since the 1950s. And we need to restore our, constitutional democracy and all of that. Well, all of that stuff, it served a purpose, because the mantra of the Republicans, this is my country, and if you don't like it, you should leave, God and the flag and all that wasn't working. And there was a need to kind of update the message and make it so that they could be mad about the status quo. And that's a sign of, we're entering a change in politics. I think more than anything, politics in the USA is getting back to normal. The kind of politics that defined the Cold War era is going away. That's not the politics we have any longer. We're starting to have, politics that is kind of normal politics in times of crisis, where you have a left, social democracy, where you have a right wing, and that rather than, there's not any reason to panic about this. It's just to kind of understand that in most countries in the world, you have a Trump, you have a Sanders. This is the system going back to normal. And yes, class consciousness and the understanding that that capitalism is a problem, that's going to become more widespread among the population, and we shouldn't be surprised by that. It's only a matter of time. What I would say is probably the weirdest thing about U.S. politics is that there's this alignment where the way things are aligned. It's like the white working class is Republican, and the white middle class are Democrats, and the black and brown and ethnic minorities are Democrats. And that alignment is very, very weird. And it's kind of like this idea that if you're a white worker, you must be conservative, and if you're a smart, liberal, cosmopolitan, intellectual, drinking your Starbucks coffee and, going to yoga, then you can be a Democrat. And if you're an African American, you can be a Democrat. But it's a very weird alignment. And that, there needs to be, an understanding that one can be a white worker and be opposed to capitalism. And there needs to be an effort. And I feel like one of the problems of the left is, Bernie Sanders, to his credit, he always talked about the need for what he calls a 50-state strategy, and there needs to be a reaching out to the entire population, and that a lot of the left, the way they function is they just kind of function on the margins of the Democratic Party. And it's kind of assumed that you can be a Democrat, and you can be a liberal, you can be an ultra-liberal, and then you can be a socialist or a communist. And that kind of strategy is not really going to work. The Cold War politics, the left was a middle-class phenomenon. It was kind of a bohemian middle class. Like, I've gone to college, I've learned what the USA has done around the world, so I'm educated, and I'm going to read about Marxism, and I'm this middle class, and that's not real politics. The Communist Party of the 1930s was a working class party. It was people who worked in steel mills and factories. It was the unemployed and the hungry, and that's the kind of politics. That socialism is not anti-populism. Socialism is the original populism. Right? There's nothing more populist than socialist. Socialism is the idea that the common people ought to rise up and take control of the economy and make it work for them. That's populism. That's populism. And this idea that populism is a bad word and that populism is always racism, I mean, this is very dangerous. And this is what the Council on Foreign Relations is pushing. Just after Trump was elected, they published Foreign Affairs magazine. They published an article. It was a whole edition of their magazine called The Power of Populism. And if you read it, you would think that the only way to be a populist was to be a Nazi. And they equated Pinochet, the brutal dictator in Chile. They called him a populist, and they said he's just like Evo Morales and Hugo Chavez. I mean, this is scary stuff, and that populism, the idea that populism is the enemy, this is something that is very, very dangerous. And the right wing has no problem with right-wing populism, but left-wing populism, left-wing is the original populism. There's nothing more populism than socialist. Socialism is populism, right? It's true populism. And the fact that so many people on the left, scoff at populism, they hate populism, that's not a good sign. Eugene Debs was a populist. William Z. Foster was a populist. Gus Hall, I'd say, even he was a populist in his own way. So we need to get away from this idea that you can't be a populist and be a leftist. So let's see who else is talking to me here. Oh boy, wow, a lot happening. They're all just coming at me right now. Oh boy, we got 38 people watching here. Sorry, Caleb, your channel is being trolled by white nationalist trolls. Oh boy, well, who cares? That's all right. What else? How the elites... I'm just getting a lot of things coming down here. The right-left paradigm distracts the masses from the true power. Yeah, that's interesting. I've met so many people, and this is a really common thing for like young millennials right now, is they'll say, "Well, I'm physically conservative and socially liberal." But interestingly, if you go outside of the United States, and especially if you go to the, what you might call the third world or the poorer countries of the world, most people are the opposite. They're socially conservative and physically liberal. People want jobs to be provided. They want education to be provided. They want the government to be controlling the economy. But at the same time, they're also, they don't really care for gay marriage. They don't really care for abortion. They like the family. They like the traditional family structure. They believe in religion. And most people in the world are kind of the opposite of these libertarians. And I've noticed, also whenever, most of the time when someone says, well, I'm socially liberal and physically conservative, they don't know what either of those things mean. That's something smart that they can say. But anyway, let's see what else is on people's minds. Anti-women's liberation. That is interesting. I don't want to get into this too much, but I think, and the weird thing is that the term women's liberation or being for women's rights or being for feminism is almost universal. In fact, I remember when I was in college, I had so many professors who were women, who were Republicans, who were anti-abortion, but insisted that they were feminists. Everyone says they're feminists, but then there's also this weird, it's like, so anyone can say they're a feminist no matter what their politics are, but at the same time, then there's this like contempt for feminists. It's like feminists are bad, feminists are something you shouldn't be. It's very weird. It's very, very weird. It's like, so the word feminist has almost lost a meaning, where feminist just means you believe women should be equal or have rights and should be respected. But then at the same time, it also has this, there's a lot of men in particular that are like very hostile to feminism, and they get angry about feminism. And that's very weird also. I don't quite understand it. It's like the word feminism has, it's got like, at the same time, it's kind of lost any, like, it's like you can't really say what someone believes when they're a feminist on the one hand, but on the other hand, there's guys who, if a woman so much as says she's a feminist, they get angry. I don't understand it. It's a strange word. It's taken on strange connotations. But yeah. So what else is going on here? What country, capitalist or socialist, is how the wealth is redistributed? Oh boy. Oh boy. Yeah. what's going on in the chat here? I like to keep up with the chat. That's what makes lives interesting. Roy Moore campaign made me lose faith in evangelicals. Well, that whole thing was interesting. That whole Roy Moore thing. Roy Moore, I mean, it was like the entire mainstream media was against him. I didn't like Roy Moore at all. I mean, the guy's a creationist. I mean, the guy, there's some very, 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 very serious allegations about what the guy did that were, that someone who actually did those things should not be in public office. But it was weird to see, this one special election in Alabama just kind of dominate mainstream media. And I don't even remember who was the guy who won. I mean, at the time he was all over the news, and they're saying, "What a guy!" I mean, this is such a huge victory for the Democrats. It's like the Democrat who won, he won because he wasn't Roy Moore. That's why he won. I mean, he could have been anybody. He wasn't Roy Moore. That's all there was to that. And the people that wanted to make it like this guy is a strong leader of the Democratic Party, and he was not Roy Moore. What's interesting is that the politics that Roy Moore espoused, the more hardline conservative stuff, that stuff is probably the dominant position in the Republican Party right now. And I think that's what we learned from that. And we learned that when Roy Moore got the nomination. We learned that when Trump won, too. I mean, that the Republican Party, they're kind of at a crossroads. Are they going to be, the party of Ronald Reagan, or are they going to be the party of, the John Birch Society? And it's kind of like they're at a crossroads. So the Republican Party is kind of struggling to figure out who it really is. It's the Steve Bannon element versus the neocons. And I think the Steve Bannon element is how average Republicans feel, just like the Bernie Sanders element is how average Democrats feel. Right? Most Democrats are Bernie Sanders, in their politics. Maybe they didn't vote for him. Maybe they felt like he wasn't electable or whatever. But if you ask the average Democrat, especially someone who's like involved in Democratic Party stuff, what they think, they're more like Bernie Sanders. And if you talk to the average Republican, they're a lot more like Roy Moore. They're a lot more like Steve Bannon than like John McCain. And that's the reality. And so you wonder, why are these parties not reflecting those views? Well, they say, well, they run to the middle. And, the two-party system is a really weird aspect. I mean, it's a result of the way the U.S. Constitution is set up. But you get a lot of people who don't agree with each other, who are, in the same camp. It's quite strange. It's quite a strange phenomenon. Let's go and see what else folks are saying. Can you explain why China backs the sanctions against the DPRK? Well, actually, my friend, China prevented an oil embargo against North Korea. That was actually broken by the Duran, and China prevented there from being an oil embargo. The USA really wants an oil embargo on North Korea right now, and what is not being reported on is that an oil embargo on North Korea would result in mass death. This entire crisis, this entire nuclear crisis, started with an oil embargo. Basically, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the USA could not purchase, or not the USA, the DPRK could not purchase oil, and that their food system, this is the mountainous part of the country. I went over this in the last live, but this is the mountainous part of the country. Their food system came to a grinding halt. Well, China was able to maneuver and prevent there from being a new oil embargo against North Korea. So there you go. I mean, now keep in mind, China is also doing business with the United States. I mean, China is in an interesting position, and on top of that, Russia and China very strongly feel like the nuclear non-proliferation treaty should stay in effect, right? I mean, that in their position, if you look at it, the nuclear non-proliferation treaty kind of puts a cap on the arms race. It prevents there from being like an all-out arms race. So when North Korea withdrew from the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, that opened up the possibility of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty being removed. And Russia and China very much, in my analysis, I mean, I don't know, but in my analysis, Russia and China very much want the nuclear non-proliferation treaty to stay intact. And I think that that's a big factor in all of this. And at the same time, I mean, we know that North Korea, they have acquired nuclear weapons because they are under attack. They're facing an attack, and they feel that this is the best way to defend themselves. And that if people wanted to end the crisis, the way to do it, it would be quite easy to resolve the crisis if you did the opposite of what the USA is doing. If you started setting up business deals, there's this plan for the Iron Silk Road, the Trans-Asian Railway, and they've actually signed the treaty and everything, for there to be a not a high speed, but a railway from South Korea up into North Korea, into China, into Russia, and into Europe. right? And that was already going to be constructed, and then the axis of evil speech and all that, and now it's been completely derailed, pun intended. But the Iron Silk Road, that was the road to peace on the Korean Peninsula, isolating the DPRK, putting sanctions on them, making it so that they can't sell their coal on the international market. All of that is only increasing tensions. The USA does not want peace with North Korea. The USA is trying to, they're pushing North Korea up against a wall. North Korea was up against that wall in 1994. They announced that they were going to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Bill Clinton went there and offered them all kinds of oil and stuff. Then Congress didn't fund it. They didn't get it. This whole crisis, this idea that North Korea is out to get the United States and North Korea is coming to get us all, it's really the opposite. The USA is at war with North Korea. It does not recognize the government of North Korea. 4 million people killed during the Korean War, millions more starving to death after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when they couldn't import oil and their food system came to a halt, and the arduous March period. The USA has been pretty vicious to North Korea. They're up against a wall, and they feel like nuclear weapons is a way to protect themselves. This crisis is being driven by that. And all along, Russia and China, throughout this entire crisis, they've said what's needed is what they call a double freeze. They say, okay, the USA can end these provocative military exercises in the South, and in the North, they'll end their nuclear proliferation and their missile tests. And at no point has the USA ever entertained this. It's like, we want the crisis in the Korean Peninsula to end, but, every year we do this huge practice, this huge rehearsal for nuking and all-out war with North Korea. Yeah, we're just going to keep doing that. So if the USA really wanted to resolve this crisis, why are they not willing to talk about a double freeze? I mean, that would be something that would resolve the crisis, a double freeze. The USA would end its provocative military exercises in South Korea that it does every year, in which they threaten all-out war, and North Korea is wondering, you have to wonder, it's like they practice, they bring all their airplanes right to the border, and they stop. Oh, it's just a drill. You have to remember, North Korea is probably thinking every time they do these exercises, is it really going to be a drill this time? I mean, they're faking North Korea out, essentially, is what's going on here, and that's very provocative. And so, yes, they're shooting off missiles in response. They're developing nuclear weapons. I mean, this crisis is spawned by the USA, just going all out against North Korea and having been attacking North Korea for a long time. So the way this crisis is portrayed in the media is just completely false. Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Vladimir Lenin. Great book. I wish people would read it. I'm so sick of people telling me that imperialism is McDonald's, or that imperialism is the fact that they listen to American music in third world countries. Imperialism is a system. Imperialism is a system, and it's a system about keeping the world poor. It's not about modernizing countries and they lose their beautiful primitive culture and that's not what's going on. That's not what imperialism is. This kind of academic left culture, you might call it a cultural Marxist or a cultural leftist definition of imperialism, is not the actual definition. Read Imperialism by Lenin. Imperialism is spheres of influence. It's captive markets. It's keeping the world poor so that financial monopolies in the West can have absolute power. That's what imperialism is. It's a system in which finance capital located in the Western countries maintains control over the world markets. That's what imperialism actually is. Countries around the world who are struggling to break free from imperialism, they often want to modernize their country. You go to any country that is trying to break out of imperialism. Do they want to keep living in huts? Do they want to not have running water? No, they want running water. They want electricity. They want modern universities and educational systems. And that's why they're fighting imperialism, because imperialism keeps those things intact. When the British were in India, did they fight against the caste system? Did they go there and try to be quote unquote white saviors and try to get rid of the caste system? No, they reinforced the caste system. They reinforced the repression of women. They reinforced some of the patriarchal stuff and all of that. That was what the British did, because that kind of thing kept the place easier to control. When the British went into India, it had a huge textile industry, and so did the British go there and develop it and say, all right, start making us cloth for us? No. They burned all the textile mills, and they forced the people of India to import their cloth from Great Britain, from the British textile mills. See, that's what imperialism really is. Imperialism doesn't bring development, and leftists, it's so bizarre, but it's like they buy into the imperialist idea of bringing development, but they think it's not moral or something, and they think that that primitivism is beautiful and it's like diversity and it's cultural and all that. No, ISIS is not beautiful, and the reason that ISIS exists is because modern countries that were independent and developing and breaking out of imperialism, modernizing, like the Ba'ath socialist government in Iraq, like the Ba'ath socialist government in Syria, they were blown to bits. And these forces of primitivism that are supported by the West came in. ISIS is primitivism. It's reactionary, it's nasty, but imperialism loves that. Imperialism is not about modernizing the world. Imperialism is about keeping the world poor and primitive so that there can be a monopoly, and everyone has to buy their goods from the Western billionaire, banker-controlled corporations. That's what imperialism actually is. People should read that book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. What else do we got here? The financial flaws and tax havens combining the limits of millions of people. Very interesting. You know anything about Marxist Zionism? Well, as far as I don't know about Marxist Zionism, but what they called labor Zionism or socialist Zionism was a big current. There were a lot of Jewish people, particularly Bundists, who felt like Israel needed to be created so that it could be like the first socialist country. And frankly, for the first decade of Israel's existence, it did try to present itself as kind of a left-wing cause. There's a movie called Exodus, and it glorifies the creation of Israel. It portrays it as like the struggle of the Jewish people for their national land or something like that. And the guy who wrote it was Dalton Trumbo. He was a Communist Party member, a screenwriter who was a member of the Communist Party. He had to write it under a fake name because he was blacklisted. And it's this movie glorifying Zionism, and the guy was not Jewish. He was an Italian guy. He was not he was a Zionist. He was a member of the Communist Party, and the Communist Party was supporting Israel, and he was a Zionist, but he wasn't even Jewish. When Israel when Israel began, and in the lead up to Israel's creation, it pitched itself as kind of a left-wing thing. The Soviet Union was very key in establishing Israel, and I think that probably most of the communists in the world think that's one of the greatest mistakes made by the Soviet Union. And it wasn't too long after that. I mean, nearly a decade that Israel was very anti-Soviet and was accusing the Soviet Union of being anti-Semitic. And then, when the 1967 war happened, it was pretty clear the Soviet Union was supporting Abdel Nasser and the Arab nationalist states that were fighting against imperialism, that Israel was an ally of the United States and trying to keep control of the Middle East. But yeah, when Israel began, it was presenting itself as kind of a socialist project. And most of the Marxists in the world supported Israel on that basis. Now, it's very interesting. Now, that wasn't the position of communists until the Second World War. And there's actually a pamphlet by the Communist Party USA from 1936 on Zionism. And it's actually very interesting if you read their position. It's by Earl Browder, who was their chairman at the time. Now, he later became a renegade, but at the time he was presenting the Communist Party position on Zionism. And they were quite critical of Zionism. They called it a reactionary ideology of the Jewish bourgeoisie. They said that that anti-Semitism was wrong, but so was Zionism, and that the answer was the working class being united. And Theodor Herzl and a lot of the early Zionists actually said that that Marxism was their greatest enemy because Zionism is based on the idea of a Jewish national identity, and Marxism calls for working class unity. And they feared that Marxism would kind of strip away the Jewish national identity. Very, very interesting. And while we're on that, one pet peeve I've often had all over the internet, and I meet people who insist that the Russian Revolution was paid for by Wall Street. And this is very easy to refute. Why? This is quite easy to refute. They all point to this character, this individual, this wealthy Wall Street banker, Jacob Schiff. And Jacob Schiff, he was here in New York. He was a wealthy Wall Street banker, millionaire, and he was a Zionist, and he was a big supporter of the World Zionist Organization, and all of that. And he funded something in Russia called the Russian Freedom Group. Well, the Russian Freedom Group had nothing to do with the Bolsheviks. The Russian Freedom Group did not support the October Revolution. They wanted to bring down the Tsar. The Tsar was very anti-Jewish, was leading pogroms and whatnot. But they did not support the October Revolution. So this idea that the Russian Revolution was sponsored by Wall Street, that's just not accurate. That's just completely inaccurate. And people base it on, well, Jacob Schiff, he funded Russian Freedom Group. You have to keep in mind, most of the Russian capitalists supported the February Revolution. The Tsar was incompetent. He was losing World War I. The country was in a crisis. And many people in Russia, including some of the richest of the rich, some of the nobility, lots of people in Russia wanted to bring down Tsar Nicholas II in February of 1917. So just proving that one Zionist in New York City felt that way and was giving money to people who felt that way does not prove that Lenin and the Bolsheviks were part of some plot that was funded by Wall Street. And later, the Jacob Schiff Center. Now, this is an important point. One of the biggest synagogues in New York City in the 1930s was called the Jacob Schiff Center. And the Jacob Schiff Center was very anti-communist. It was not a communist place. It was in the Bronx, and it was one of the main centers of anti-communism among Jews in New York City. So this idea that Jacob Schiff, the Russian Revolution was a plot by Jacob Schiff, people need to get off this. This is just anti-Semitism. And frankly, what's very interesting is it's understood that there was some German support for Lenin. I mean, that's documented. At some point, the Germans, they helped Lenin get to Russia. How much money did they give him? And part of the reason that the Nazis in Germany were constantly harping about, oh my God, Jewish, Bolshevik, part of the reason they were always harping on that, because they were kind of embarrassed about the fact that the German government, the Kaiser, he had been tied into the Bolsheviks himself, and that was kind of a cover. And this idea that, I don't know, Zionism, well, let's get on another topic. Let's talk about something else. But I am just very annoyed when people try to say that the Russian Revolution was sponsored by Wall Street, because that's very easy to refute, but people really want to believe it. I've had people tell me that, oh, Leon Trotsky was just this Broadway actor they hired. No, Leon Trotsky was a Russian exile. He was the editor of Novi Mir. I'm probably butchering that. Forgive me for not speaking Russian. If anyone here can understand Russian correctly, it meant New World or New Peace. It was a magazine of Russian exiles. Trotsky was living in Brooklyn and in the Lower East Side, and he was a well-known Russian exile. And he was a radical. And when the Russian February Revolution happened, he actually gave a speech about it in Brooklyn. He and Bukharin, they actually had an event in Brooklyn, a forum that took place. Trotsky was very well known, and actually at the time the Russian Revolution happened, the October Revolution, a lot of reports internationally knew about Trotsky because he had this reputation of going around the world and giving these fiery speeches. But Lenin was kind of unknown outside of Russia, and that's kind of an interesting aspect. Now, pretty soon it became clear Lenin was the leader of the Russian Revolution, but at the time Trotsky had a much bigger international reputation. But I had someone tell me that Trotsky was just this Broadway actor the Wall Street bankers hired. That's ridiculous. That's absurd. I mean, these people, they really, and what bothers me more than that is that this stuff is very widespread. But I meet so many people who believe, or they're Leninists or communists or whatever, they believe in all this stuff, and then they hear someone say, the Bolshevik Revolution was funded by Wall Street, and they don't have a response. They haven't dug into it. They don't want to respond to this. And people believe this stuff. I mean, a lot of people believe this stuff, and so you need to be able to defend. If people say that communism is a Wall Street conspiracy, well, you have to be able to say that it's not if you want to recruit them to it. So let's get on to another topic. Let's see what else is going on out here. Oh boy. China builds its industry, needs profit from third world. Leopold II was also into the infrastructure of the Congo. I don't agree with that. I think if you look at all the railroads that China has built in Africa in recent years and compare it to all the railroads that imperialism built over the course of the hundreds of years they've been in Africa, it doesn't even compare. You can put the map up next to each other. Imperialists built railroads for the purpose of taking their goods to the ocean and shipping them out of the country, taking the resources to the ocean, the minerals and whatnot, and getting them out of the country. That's what the imperialists did. When China builds infrastructure, they're hoping to stimulate a domestic economy. They want to build up domestic businesses so that they can trade with China, and then they can both get rich and get richer in the process, right? Imperialism, they go into a country and they crush the domestic economy. They don't want them to have any domestic manufacturers or any domestic businesses. They want an absolute monopoly. China goes into a country, they build infrastructure because the bigger the domestic economy of this country gets, the bigger China will have out of a domestic economy to trade with. This is countries that are developing, trading with each other and developing each other in the process. And that's, the countries China is trading with, they're not crushing the domestic market. They're kind of doing the opposite. They're stimulating it. That's their intention, because the bigger the domestic market gets, the bigger they can trade with it. The imperialists have a completely different approach. It's just a completely different thing. And it's based on what's really in their interest. Wall Street banks were the first to offer loans to the Bolshevik government. That's not actually true. In fact, there was a blockade on the Russian Soviet, the Russian Soviet Republic. The Soviet Union didn't come into existence until 1921, but there was Soviet Russia, they called it, and there was actually a huge blockade and a humanitarian crisis. They weren't getting loans. They weren't getting anything from anyone. So that's just inaccurate. The blockade that took place, a lot of people starved. There was just an absolute blockade. And one of my favorite writers, Anna Louise Strong, she went over there to Soviet Russia with the Quakers because those were the only folks who were going there, and they were actually, in some cases, risking arrests to go over there because they were trying to feed people in Soviet Russia. And actually, during the Russian Civil War, I believe it was 15 different countries sent troops to put down the Bolshevik Revolution. 15 different countries. And one of the things that actually went on was at that point, one of the major oil-producing parts of the world was Azerbaijan and the oil fields of Azerbaijan. And the British, it was British bankers mainly who controlled the oil fields. Rothschilds, actually, British bankers. And so British troops were sent to Azerbaijan to seize the oil fields of Baku. And that was where a lot of the fighting went on in the Russian Civil War, was as, these oil fields that were controlled by British bankers, including the Rothschilds, who they say are the ones who sponsored the Russian Revolution. Well, the British troops were sent to control and seize the oil fields away, from the Bolsheviks for the Rothschilds. So that whole conspiracy, they're kind of missing the point there. But let's keep reading. Venezuela isn't socialist. More than 70% of their economy is private sector. Yes, but I've been to Venezuela, and even the private sector in Venezuela is completely centered around the state-controlled oil. Venezuela, that's actually one of their biggest problems, is all they have in that country, their economy is centered around state-controlled oil. Like even small stores, even small, stores get a subsidy from the government, and that comes from oil. So, and that's the whole thing. It's like China, where you can have a private sector, but if everything revolves around things that are state-controlled, and those, then that's not capitalism. Capitalism is an economy that functions according to profits, and even most of the private sector, the majority of the private sector is dependent on the government-controlled oil resources for subsidies in order to continue functioning. And it's a big problem. Venezuela, people there say to me, what we need is a domestic steel industry. What we need is we need to be growing our own food. That's what people are largely saying there, but it's a big problem. But Venezuela, for years, it's just been the entire country revolves around oil, and that can be a problem. Alrighty. What else is going on? Thoughts on Antifa? Well, here's the thing about Antifa. I'm going to take a drink of water, and I'm not going to go on for too much longer. I think I'll be on for another 5 or 10 minutes, and then I'm going to get off. But I'm glad you all joined me for the live. I'm enjoying this. I really am. But basically, Antifa, if you look at the history, in the 1930s, fascists were going around, they were just murdering and slaughtering communists, right? That was what they were doing. They would, guns and mass murder of communists. They took power in Germany and, put all the social democrats and communists into concentration camps. In Italy, it was a similar kind of situation. And as they were going around the killing, there was a debate among the left. And some people on the left said, well, we should start working with the government. We should ask the government to outlaw these fascist groups. And other people said, no, we've got to defend ourselves. We can't count on the government to protect us because a lot of these fascist groups are tied in with the police and the military. And that was a legitimate argument to have. And when people are being killed, they have a right to defend themselves. But that's different than what's happening today. What's happening today, and I'm not saying that these groups aren't hateful, I'm not saying that they don't kill people and do awful things, but what's happening today for the most part is that these people who believe in, pro-Hitler things or white nationalist things or whatever, awful ideas, they go someplace and they announce, we're going to have a rally. And they show up, and a bunch of people in black masks who no one knows who they are show up and beat the crap out of them. And then the media goes, look, these fascists, they've been persecuted, and this is how we're trained to think about free speech. This is the way Americans think. So, and then the fascists go, yes, I'm persecuted. And they get to be the center of attention, and everyone hears what they believe, and their ideas are out there. And meanwhile, the people who attacked them are just these anonymous people in black masks. No one has any clue who they are. They're not putting forward any ideas. They don't, and so the fascist ideas get all this advertising, and they're out there, and everyone hears all about them, and they get to be the victims. And the left comes across as these scary people in black masks who go around beating people up and trying to silence them. And at the end of the day, the fascists, they win. I mean, that plays into their favor. They look like they're the victims. And on top of that, I mean, the bigger problem is, and this is the scary thing, is that there's so many videos on the internet. Infowars, go there. Where, there'll be, left-wing rallies, and they'll walk up to people and say, didn't communism kill 700 million bajillion people? And the person selling the communist newspaper or whatever, will go, I mean, and it's just like, the left doesn't have an ideological response to this. Now, the right wing is out there pushing their ideology, pushing their beliefs, and the left doesn't challenge it and doesn't have a belief system. And most people on the left that I've talked to, they have this attitude, history and theory is not important. Someone once told me, Caleb, you're always talking about Lenin and, history and all of that. That's white. Only white people do that. And you're nothing. What really matters is if you're in the streets. That's the attitude on the left. Basically, this is Edward Bernstein. The movement is everything. The goal is nothing. Have big rallies, march around, repeat slogans, and who cares about facts and details? Well, the problem is that, when people are upset and people who've been told their whole lives, people who aren't part of this movement, this little enclave called the movement, but people who've been told all their lives that communism kills millions of people and it's evil, if you want to convince them not to, become far right and instead to become far left, you might have to have some facts and some arguments to back that up. I had a debate with Augustus Sol Invictus, who's one of these, far right, alt-right types. And you watch it. What does he believe in? You watch the debate. I mean, it's not edited very much. I mean, very little was cut from him, especially. I let, his beliefs are there. What does he believe in? He believes that if you get robbed, it's your fault because you didn't, have a gun to protect yourself. What? So we shouldn't arrest robbers? Like, what is that about? I mean, he believes that Confederate monuments are great. Why? Because they are. I don't know. Like, these people, they don't have very many ideas. But the problem is on the left, you don't have ideas either. You just have this, this sloganeering. Like, for example, like this is one sign that I've seen at a lot of left-wing rallies. And I'll end with this. I'm going to conclude with this. But this is one sign that I've seen at a lot of left-wing rallies. And it says, what is it? A world without borders. I know what that person means, okay? What they mean is that we should get to a society where we should get to the point where there's so much development and that, we can have a classless, stateless world and we don't need to have borders. People can kind of just go where they want. I'm totally for that. And the idea that, that people are, coming into the USA and, the crisis of mass migration has been fomented by imperialism and all of that. However, if you march around with a sign that says for a world without borders, most average people are going to look at you and go, what? So we just shouldn't have borders? Well, then anyone could just come in. And they're going to look at you like you're crazy, right? And on the left, you can't say, okay, maybe we shouldn't say a world without borders. Maybe we should say stop scapegoating immigrants, the real enemy are the capitalists, something like that. But on the left, if you say to that person, hey, I know what you mean. I'm with you that we need to strive for a world without state repression and that the eventual goal should be a classless, stateless world. But maybe the world without borders sign, the immediate response you get is racist. How dare you try to tell? And so it's like you're not allowed to say. So to average people, they see a sign that says a world without borders, and they think, well, I really think we ought to really have borders. And they're not interested in joining the left. Meanwhile, these fascists, when they go get beaten up and all of that, they make logical arguments. And you're not allowed to make logical arguments on the left. If you do that, you're one of those white men, and how dare you be white-splained. It's ridiculous. It's a big problem that we have. I'm all for being sensitive. I'm all for being inclusive. But, I spent 8 years in a Marxist group, and it was scary. We couldn't. It was just like so many times I was told that we shouldn't engage people, and that if we just have rallies and march around in a circle, and that was the answer to everything, and that's really scary, and it's leading to a crisis. And then I debated Augustus Sol Invictus. I debated him. You should watch the debate. It's on my YouTube channel. I debated him, and there's nothing there. I've had so many people have watched the debate and they said, I don't even know what that guy stands for. They fall apart. They don't have ideas. They're just angry assholes. That's what, forgive me for using a swear word. It's not totally whatever, but these folks, they're just angry. They're angry and they're bigoted and they don't really know what to believe. And, I think they like, part of the reason that these far right elements are attracted to Hitler is because they think Hitler was mean and they're mean and they don't even know what they're talking about. Right, and that's why they've been attracted to this ideology. Is they're just bigoted and hateful people. But they're gaining momentum, and people who should be becoming leftists are being recruited by these people because the left has become this, just become this mob of people in black masks who don't want to talk about ideology because only racist white men do, and that's a big problem. But anyhow, what else is new in here? I'm gonna go on for a little while longer, and then we're gonna have to end. Oh boy, what else is going on here? Think outside the box, collapse the box. We need to reclaim the left. Yeah, I mean, I don't get it. I mean, when I was young, when I was like 15, I read a book called Toward Soviet America by William Z. Foster. I loved that book. I mean, that was just amazing, I mean, it was like, that was the politics that I was attracted to. That was great. I mean, he talks about the toilers and the class struggle. He talks about what the USSA would be like, the United Soviet States of America. It was the Communist Party line from what they call the third period, or it was the time, the early 1930s, 1928 to 1935. The 1932 presidential election was what the book was written for. That's a great book. That politics I like. It's the class struggle, the common people struggling for justice against the bankers and the billionaires, rejecting racism and sexism, and trying to build a new world. And yeah, that's great stuff. I don't see that on the left. And on the left, I see a lot of forces that really want chaos, and they're not interested in ideology. They're not interested in theory, and they just kind of want to tear things down and tear people down. Well, I want to build a new country. I want a country. I want a new society to emerge in which people are treated fairly, and which people are provided for and have education and jobs and all of that. That's what I want. And I feel like these other forces, they just want to tear people down and punish people, and and correct everybody. And it's a big problem. It's a bit of a problem that we've got. What else is going on here? People are saying stuff. Left and right are outdated. Well, no, they're not, but they're just confused. Okay, so the word left actually comes out of the French Revolution, and if you read the quote, it was after the National Assembly separated from the other estates in France, it called itself. It formed a separate body. And that separate body was the people that were more critical of feudalism and were critical of the king. And so if you actually read the entry, they talk about it was the innovators that sat on the left, the innovators. That was the term that was used. And I think that that's what the left really is. It's those who want to march forward, those who believe in the concept of historical progress and want to build a new world, want to create greater equality. That's the left, and that's what the left is. Now, unfortunately, it's very confusing because there are a lot of people on the left who don't want that. There are a lot of people on the left who idealize primitivism and hate the modern world and hate technology. That's not leftist in my understanding. So it is rather confusing, and oddly, paganism and the occult and things like that were actually considered to be right wing back in the 1930s. It was the Nazis and the fascists that liked that stuff. The communists were always about materialism and dialectics and hard materialism, and Christianity was like the centrist position. And Aleister Crowley. Now the people that are into Aleister Crowley are like leftists. That's a big thing. It's like, the occult and pagan, but Aleister Crowley was a very, very right-wing conservative. And Julius Evola, who was one of the main ideologues of Italian fascism. I mean, he was all about Hinduism and Tibet. He loved Tibet, right? Because it was such a rigid authoritarian society. It could be the antidote to class struggle in the West. A lot of things, this primitivism, paranormalism, all that was associated with the far right. But now you see that in left-wing circles because it's bohemian and it's hippie, and it's a distortion of left-wing politics. And so there are a lot of people on the left that aren't really left-wing. I consider left-wing to be believing in social progress and trying to make a more egalitarian and fair society and advance human civilization. That's what left means. It means something else to other people, and I'm not quite sure what it means to them. I don't understand how one can be a supporter of the Dalai Lama and be on the left, for example. I mean, the Dalai Lama, if you think that he was trying to modernize Tibet, you're deeply wrong. What else is going on here? Who's talking in the chat? Who's talking at me today? Crazy times going on here. Wow, we've been on for quite a while here. We've been having a good chat here. Let's switch gears for just a minute. See what's going on. Crazy time. So, what do people make of this whole UFO thing, right? So like there was something in the government, they were investigating UFOs or something. I mean, I'm not sure what to think about that. I mean, UFO just means unidentified flying object, and if there was an unidentified flying object, I mean that would be NORAD's concern. I mean that would be the concern of the the U.S. Sky Command and all of that. So there you go. I see that the daughter of Eric Garner. Eric Garner was a man who was choked to death by the NYPD on film. It was just an awful incident here in New York City. The NYPD choked him to death. The famous "I can't breathe." Well, apparently his daughter is having a coma, and she's in a coma in the hospital after having a heart attack, and people are very concerned about her. I remember being in the streets the night I was covering it. At that point, I was working with Press TV, and we covered all the protests that were happening in the aftermath of Eric Garner's death. And there were a lot of protests going on, and the Garner family, they've been very loud. I mean, what they alleged was that Eric Garner had been selling loose cigarettes, Lucy cigarettes. That was their allegation, and for that, the police moved in on him, and he was eventually choked to death. And the police officers who did it faced no accountability. And I'll tell you, you'll hear these cases now of police, in places like Ohio and Kansas, and they'll kill somebody. All over the country, there's this escalation of police brutality. And I got to tell you, all the people, that are in Rust Belt states, white working class folks who are just like, what's going on now? Well, I'll tell you what's happening is they've been doing this to African American folks for years. And all the white people have bought into this idea that, oh, this is not my problem. They've made excuses, and now the police state is escalating it, and they're doing it to you, because if they can do what they can do to the black and brown people today, they can do to you tomorrow. And the fact that there is a division, and the fact that so many white workers, whenever they hear about police brutality, they just go, oh, and they just sit there and try to make excuses for the cops. That's hurting us. It's hurting us in the long term, because at the end of the day, the police state is a threat to everyone. This emerging low-wage police state, and that's the term that I use to describe it, is a threat to everyone in this country. So what's going on here? UFOs are creatures that live in space. See Constable. Oh, there you go. All kinds of stuff. Someone says they've known cops that are psychopaths and sociopaths, a requirement to do the job. Well, I don't doubt that there are a lot of people that become police officers who are good people, who, believe in what they're doing, want to protect people from crime. But it's interesting, there's the Zimbardo prison study, and that's a very interesting study, that when you put people in positions of power, it affects how they think. It kind of reminds me, you always meet teachers who are convinced that the kids are oppressing them. These are adults. These are people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. And they're convinced that this room full of 7-year-olds is somehow tyrannical and they're oppressed by them. But you talk to any prison guard, they are convinced that these prisoners have all the power and are repressing them. And if you talk to cops, they think that criminals have it great. And it's a very strange mentality. You give people, power and authority, and the way that they think about things kind of shifts. And I want to be careful when I try to make it all personal. I feel like, the problem comes with the job. The problem is not any individual. And I have no doubt that there are all kinds of people that if you met them when they were not on duty and they were not in their uniform and you didn't talk to them about politics, obviously, you might find them to be a charming, nice person. I mean, the problem seems to be with the job. The problem isn't with the individual. And we need to be careful about that. And I think that's an important thing to clarify. What else is going on? What else is happening here? Wage stagnation. Look at the images. Yes, that's wages are dropping. Trump keeps talking about how big and how great things are in the economy right now. That everything is, oh my goodness, unemployment's low. Well, wages are lower than they've ever been. I mean, wages are just really, really low right now, and wages are really declining in the Western world. This is a reality, and that's why folks, if there's any of those third worldists watching, you're pointing out a real problem, right? The first world, third world divide, the stratification of the working class in the Western countries, that's a totally real thing. I'm not denying that, but something's happening now. I mean, the standard of living in the first world is drastically decreasing. And if you just want to write off the first world and say, oh, they're all just a bunch of bought-off exploiters, things could actually change. The world is changing very rapidly. The Western world is rapidly changing economically, and this low-wage police state that I keep emphasizing is emerging, and people don't like it. You don't go to any part of the country, people don't like it. But the question is, what are they going to do about it? Now, for a while, Obama was going to save them from it, and then Trump was supposed to save them from it. But the reality is, this is the way capitalism is going. Capitalism is moving in one direction. It's moving toward a low-wage police state. And the question is, will forces emerge that will challenge that? Will there be resistance? Will there be a movement that offers an alternative way? In 1939, the Communist Party of the United States, they ran a presidential election, and the book and the slogan of the presidential campaign was "The Way Out." The way out. And I think there are millions of people across the United States that are looking for a way out right now. They see that the government is tapping their phones. They see that the wages are declining. They see all kinds of problems breaking out throughout U.S. society, and they want a way out. They want things to change. They are just not okay with the way things are. And the question is there going to be a left that offers them a way out? Is there going to be forces that come forward with a program and say, yes, this is the way out, and we have a direction, a line of march? You read the Communist Manifesto, right? That's the line of march. They're going to have a line of march to offer them a way out of this crisis. I don't know. Will forces emerge? That remains to be seen as a question, but that seems to be the pressing need of the moment for anyone who thinks in Marxist terms. So there you go. What's going on in all the world? Well, look, folks, I wanted to just end. I'm going to end here in a little bit, but I just wanted to say this, that I feel like, I'm here on YouTube, here on Christmas evening, but, this is about something bigger than me. I could just be a guy. I could be on here talking about, about video games or Star Trek or something like that, but I'm just a guy, but I feel like we're part of something bigger. Right? Because what's going on now, Eric Schmidt has been censoring the internet, basically. Net neutrality is up in question. We're part of a movement because there's millions of people who don't like the way the world is going. And there is an alternative rising around the world. There are many countries that have broken out of this, this billionaire, monopolist, Wall Street capitalist system that's driving the country toward a low-wage police state. And there is an alternative rising in the world, and, we're here in the Western countries, but we're not alone. I mean, many people are unhappy with the way things are. But what we're doing here with these YouTube videos, on these YouTube lives, and, this is very, very special. But I'll say what I said before, which is that I need you. I need everyone watching this to get involved. Please, we need more people getting on these lives and asking questions. And we need people who aren't, they aren't up on Tito and Mao and all that. We need people who are just, just regular folks who want to ask questions and get involved. We need the message that's here on this YouTube channel and on Facebook and elsewhere. That we need the message that I'm spreading here to get out there. We need the world to hear it. I need you to get involved. I need you. That's, I'm talking to you. That's right. That's you, the person watching this video. You. I need you to get involved in helping to spread the message that we have here. Maybe you don't agree with everything I say, I agree with everything I say, but maybe you don't. Maybe there's some things I say that you like, some things that I say that you don't like. I need you to get involved in spreading the word about what we're doing here, because what you're hearing here is something special. You won't hear this on other YouTube channels. You won't hear this anywhere else, right? We're offering economic analysis here. We're offering kind of a unique geopolitical perspective. This is very, very special what's happening here. But if people like you, and I'm talking to you, that's right, you, the person watching this, if you don't help spread it, if you don't help people get involved, if you don't, put yourself to be part of this, if you don't take an active role in trying to spread the word, people aren't going to hear it. The crackdown that's happening on alternative media and on the information revolution is very, very real. I definitely need you to get involved. I absolutely need you. We need the message to be spread. We need things to be promoted very, very desperately. And you ought to make your own YouTube videos, for a while it was the big trend to trash Jason Unruh. That was the big thing, and he's someone on here. He makes a lot of YouTube videos. He's been doing it. I don't agree with everything he says. He doesn't agree with a lot of what I say. That's okay. We have a similar perspective. We're both anti-imperialist, both anti-capitalist. We both would like to see socialism come into existence. We both know a lot about China and Mao. We don't agree about all of that, but that's okay. But, for a long time I would run into people who were bashing him, and they'd always say, oh, he's this or he's that. And I'd say to them, guys, if you don't like the guy, outdo him. Go make your own videos. Go make your own videos that have your perspective. Outdo him. No, I can't do that. Oh, he's this, he's that. I'm just like, come on now, okay? That's the thing. Is if folks don't like me, okay, I was talking a minute ago. I was talking to the people who like me, but to those who don't like me, those who disagree with what I said here, those who think I'm no good, outdo me. Get on YouTube, get on Facebook, and make your own videos. Preach the message in a way that you think is better than me. Outdo me, right? The more the merrier. Like, there are not enough people on social media, on the internet, or just out in the world talking about these ideas. And those who are way too isolated. It's way too much of an enclave. The message that we're spreading, this idea that the banks, factories, and industries should be run by the people, and we could have a rationally planned society, that we don't have to accept the rule of the billionaire elite, and that we don't have to have the irrationality and insanity of an economy based on profits. That message needs to be out there, and you don't have to hear it from me. My name doesn't have to be associated with it at all, but we need this to be out there. If you want to make your own videos or make your own articles or do whatever you can, do it. Or, if you really want to do me a favor and you don't feel like doing it yourself, or you do feel like doing it yourself and you want to help me out in the process, please, we need to spread the word. We desperately need to spread the word. These are very scary times we're living in. I remember what it was like in the 1990s before the internet was what it is today, when it was just getting started, and people had no clue. People just had no clue. And that's very scary to think about. And I'd like to think that, the billionaires and the financial elite won't be able to roll back the information revolution and defeat the wheel of history. I'd like to think that the information revolution is kind of like the printing press. The printing press was very key in bringing down feudalism in Europe. I'd like to think that, but I don't know that for a fact. There's a lot of things that are up in the air, and a lot of it depends on you. You can be a decisive player in probably the greatest social revolution in all of history. If the global system of capitalism were to be overturned and something rational, a planned economy were to come into emergence, the human race would just leap very, very far. I can tell you technology would just take off. I can tell you we would defeat world hunger. I can tell you the life expectancy of the human race would probably double. The things that could be achieved if the irrationality of the rule of the dollar and the rule of profits were taken away are quite massive. We could get rid of wars. We could start developing the world. We could get to the point where there'd be like a 1-hour work week. People could just spend the rest of their time doing what they feel like doing. There's so much that could be done. Technology has advanced, but because of capitalism, technology is chained to just making profits for a small group of people. That's the problem, is that those of us who don't own the big banks and factories and industries, we need to take action and come together and assert human control over the industries and over the economy. That's the socialist message. That's what socialists have been saying since the beginning of time. And the necessity for what we're saying is becoming more and more true than ever before. So I'm going to take one quick look in the chat, see if there's anything to reply to. See what's going on here. Memes are powerful. Very true. I love memes. Memes are great. We need more memes. I love memes. What else? I'm not going to repeat that one. Save the children. Yeah, I think children need to be saved. There's so many children around the world that are suffering. You need open source high tech. I'm a fan of open source. Do you still consider yourself a dialectical materialist? Yes and no. I think that there is, the fact that, the history, that everything in the universe is in motion. That's absolutely true. And that the contradiction, is how that motion is constantly in motion. All that exists is matter in motion. Yeah, for the most part. Yeah, I guess I agree with that. I don't want to get too much into that, and I do think that there are, I think that there is a bit of an underestimation of like spiritual things and the importance of emotions and human will and things like that is a little bit underestimated by some people that are really, really into dialectical materialism. But historical materialism, that's absolute, no question about that. That's historical materialism 100%. Dialectical materialism, sure, for the most part. And I think it's very important, and it's very important to understand. So many people think that Karl Marx was a guy who went around like drawing blueprints for the ideal world. No, you want to understand Karl Marx, you got to understand dialectical and historical materialism. What else? Message retracted. Okay, well, I don't know what that means. Death cult Armageddon. Quantum physics. You're out of my league here. I'm not a physicist. Hands off Cuba. Absolutely. We need, what's that blockade? Why aren't we doing trade with Cuba? Why is there a travel ban? It's somewhat rescinded, but it's still, why can't I just go to Cuba? I'm someone here in the USA. Why can't I just get on the plane and go to Cuba? The Cubans have no problem with that. I'm totally with you. Laura Floyd gives me a thumbs up. I don't know you, Laura, but I'm giving you a thumbs up back. You're cool because you're watching my channel and you're giving me a thumbs up. That's cool enough for me. Great. Let me look up here, see if there's anything else. Mao did nothing wrong. Well, that's a little bit hard. I mean, when Mao, Mao aligned with Pinochet, that was not a good thing. When Mao, when he had that position that the Soviet Union was the main danger to the people of the world, and that justified an alliance with the United States, the three worlds theory. I'm not all about that. I'm totally not all about that. And in all honesty, I'm not a big fan of the Gang of Four. You can argue that the Cultural Revolution with Lin Biao, when they were, fighting to maintain a revolutionary position, that was the beginning. And some people, some people, you can talk about that, but the Gang of Four period. I mean, what the Gang of Four were doing in China. Anyone I've ever met from China, the official position of the Chinese Communist Party is that the Cultural Revolution was completely wrong. You will meet some Chinese people, though, who will tell you, well, that's the position, but I think the Cultural Revolution was necessary because it was important to maintain our roots. But you will meet nobody. I have never met anyone from China. I've spoken to many Chinese people, big Chinese delegations. I've never met anyone from China who says, when that Gang of Four was running things and all the young people were in the countryside and we had a down with this and down with that campaign and people were getting beaten up and publicly flogged in the street, that was great. No one tells you that. I mean, the Gang of Four, the way they were running things in the 70s, from like the fall of Lin Biao to the death of Mao Zedong, that was a pretty hard time. And if Deng Xiaoping hadn't done what he did afterwards, there's a good chance it could have been a counter-revolution. And because when Deng Xiaoping came out and introduced the market reforms and arrested the Gang of Four, there was just this huge outpouring of support. And there was a feeling in China they had to get out of poverty, and that there was a feeling that the Gang of Four, they didn't really care if China remained poor, just so long as it was, totally pure in its communist ideology and egalitarian. And Deng Xiaoping, I mean, he did what he did, and he based his ascension to power on the fact that many people in China were deeply frustrated by the economics, and they were tired of the rather hardline totalitarian stuff. They were tired of seeing one of their coworkers beaten up because he listened to Western music and stuff, and that kind of thing. It's one thing. The Cultural Revolution, when it began, it was an uprising. With Lin Biao, led like an uprising against one wing of the party that was alleged to have been wanting to restore capitalism, and the trade unions got involved, and the army got involved, and the young people got involved, and the Cultural Revolution was an uprising against the Communist Party, which many people in China felt had lost its way, and Mao also felt had lost its way. But what it became, like what you call the second stage of the Cultural Revolution, when the Gang of Four was in power, I mean, that period, people remember that as being an awful time. All the young people were sent to the countryside. People lived in terror. The rules kept changing. One day, Western music would be okay. The next day, it wouldn't be. One day, makeup would be okay. The next day, they'd be, publicly shaming all the women who'd ever worn makeup, and they'd have to wear a sign that says, "I am a rotten capitalist roader because I wore makeup." I mean, that people don't have positive memories of that kind of thing. I mean, that's a little bit different, and that it's one thing when you have an uprising from below to like demand that the party stay true to its principles, but when it becomes kind of this authoritarian, top-down, we are going to keep punishing and repressing and torturing people in order to keep true to this goal of communism, and in the meantime the economy is not getting any better, that's something a little bit different. And I think that the Cultural Revolution, it wasn't just one continuous event. Supposedly it was 10 years, 1966 to 1976, but it wasn't the same. The Gang of Four period was very different than the Lin Biao period. I think people need to really study this stuff, and that was one of the, I know so many, the Chinese Revolution is very amazing, and it's very beautiful, and really kind of illustrates what I think is, that, in the USA we say that the more things change, the more they stay the same. But the other thing, there's a saying that if you don't bend, you break, and that China's revolution has constantly been adjusting itself. And that, if you look at who Mao was in the 50s, in a lot of ways, Mao was closer to Tito, and especially the document that Mao wrote, or that the Chinese Communist Party wrote on the historical experience of the dictatorship of the proletariat, came out in 1956, around the time of the Khrushchev secret speech. They were all about de-Stalinization and all of that. Now, then in 1961, they took on the anti-revisionism, and then you had the Cultural Revolution, but, and then you had the Deng Xiaoping period, but now, in China, things are shifting again, and President Xi is leading kind of this re-emphasis of Marxist principles, and Marxist ideology is being promoted all over China right now, and so things change, and the party has constantly kind of been readjusting its approach in order to be more effective, in order to achieve their ultimate goal, which is to make China a modern, prosperous socialist society. And they've done it. They're really moving ahead toward that goal, right? 700 million people lifted out of poverty. 700 million people, all right? Throughout the Mao era, in the cities you did have industrialization, you had people taken care of, but all throughout the countryside you had a lot of people who were still desperately hungry. And now, because of the Chinese Communist Party's reforms and all that, you have millions of people that are brought out of poverty. And you think that you go to one of these people, like for example, you read China Daily, there are people in Tibet. They've never had running water before. They've never had electricity before. So the Communist Party has now moved like hundreds of thousands of Tibetans into modern housing units with electricity and running water for the first time in their whole lives. Now, do you think if you go to one of those people and say, well, those people that gave you running water and electricity, they did not have the pure line of Mao Zedong thought. They are just a bunch of revisionists who gave you that electricity. They're going to think, well, when the Gang of Four was in there, I was still living in a hut without electricity and running water. But now I've got electricity and running water. I've got a decent life. I really don't, they're going to tell you to take your dogmatism and go shove it is what they're going to tell you. And that's the thing, is that this isn't a religion. This isn't like, people have, there's the one true way. And if we just repeat the right words and everyone obeys them, that's not how this works. You can't have socialism and poverty. Socialism is a path toward abundance and development. Socialism is not a society of poverty that's fair, and that's an understanding, and the Chinese really understand that. And the Gang of Four era, there was this feeling that as long as we have the correct political line, it doesn't matter if we're obliterating poverty, and that's just not correct. Oh boy, I'm probably getting some hate for all of this. Stalin paid the clouds to stop raining. Well, there you go. What else is going? All right. Anti-capitalist memes. I love memes. Like I said before, I do love memes. Save the children, Laura Floyd. Yes, children need to be saved. I'm all for that. Capitalism is poverty. Absolutely, capitalism is poverty. I thought the rural Chinese adored Mao way more than the urban do. Well, yes, actually. In the urban areas, you have a lot of people that are newly rich that do have, from what I understand, in the urban areas, you have folks that are a little more critical of Marxism. And, a lot of the rural folks, are much more. I actually don't know. You know what I mean? I can't say that for a fact. I'm sorry. I take that back. What I just said. I don't have a position. In a lot of countries in the world, you will find more westernized folks, people that are more sympathetic to the West in urban areas, and you'll find more ideological and anti-imperialist folks in the countryside. I've never been to China. I don't know. I've met with many Chinese people. I've heard many different positions. I was just in Russia, talked to a bunch of Chinese people there that were for the World Festival Youth and Students. But, at the end of the day, I don't know. I can't speak to that. I don't know. I don't know where these sentiments are. I know that the Chinese Communist Party, Mao Zedong thought, is one of their principal beliefs. 90 million members. Mao Zedong thought. This is what they believe. Marxist-Leninist ideology, Mao Zedong thought, Deng Xiaoping theory, three representations. And that three representations comes from Jiang Zemin. So, let me look at the chat one more time. Time to go to China. You bet. I have been trying to get over there. I am hoping to get over there. I've been writing for China.org. They've been publishing my commentaries, and they do appreciate them, and I'm very proud to write for China.org. And China.org is a great website. I have a lot of admiration for the One Belt, One Road initiative, the New Silk Road, and President Xi and what he's doing. I can't wait to get his new book. I wish it would just get here. The second edition, Governance of China, Part 2. Those folks are communists. The Chinese Communist Party, they are communists. They know what they're doing, and I find it really, when people dismiss that and just assume that that they know better. I'm not sure that's the case. The Chinese Communist Party, they're ideological. They're communists. They know what they're doing. You can agree with them or disagree with them, but you have to kind of respect them and see what they've done to China. They've taken China from being one of the poorest countries in the world to being the second largest economy in the world, and they've done it, and they deserve some credit for that. All right. Well, on that note, folks, I am going to have to go. So thanks for tuning in. It was fun. We actually went for a lot longer than I thought we would, but all is okay. Have a good night.